The date is March 1971. The setting isn't a gleaming arena under television lights. It's a drafty, forgotten warehouse district on the outskirts of Amsterdam. If you were standing there, the first thing you'd notice isn't the fight itself, but the air. It's thick, damp with the chill of a Dutch spring that seems to seep straight through the brick walls and into your marrow. The smell is distinct, a heavy, honest cocktail of aged leather, floor wax, old sweat, and something metallic, like the tang of a rusted pipe. It is the scent of a place where things are broken and mended, where the only language spoken is the impact of skin on canvas. In the center of this cavernous space sits a boxing ring. It's not the pristine, well-lit canvas you'd see on a broadcast. The ropes sag just a little, the canvas is stained with the ghosts of 1,000 sparring sessions, and the lighting is harsh, yellowed, and unforgiving. Around the perimeter, a tight circle of 20 people creates a wall of bodies. These aren't casual fans. They are the locals, rough-handed kickboxers, dock workers, and hard-nosed trainers who measure a person's worth by how much punishment they can absorb before their knees buckle. And then, there is Saskia. To look at Saskia Vanderberg is to look at a physical anomaly. Standing at 6'2" and weighing in at a dense, terrifying 240 pounds, she occupies space with the ease of a lioness. She is a Rotterdam native, a product of a blue-collar world where the weak get pushed aside early. By the time she was 18, she was already the nightmare of every gym in the Netherlands. By 22, she had claimed the Dutch heavyweight championship, not in a women's division, but the open weight division. She was a woman who walked into rooms full of 6-foot men and left them looking for the exit. Saskia's physique is the result of a lifetime of singular focus. Her thighs are thicker than the waist of an average man. Her shoulders are carved from marble and gristle. When she moves, there is no wasted energy. She carries herself with the predatory confidence of someone who has fought 37 professional matches and walked away with 37 wins. But it's not just the record, it's the manner of the victories. 32 knockouts. She isn't a fighter who dances around the perimeter, waiting for an opening. She is a wrecking ball. She breaks ribs, she shatters shins, and more than once, she has hospitalized opponents who thought they were stepping into a match, only to find themselves stepping into an ambulance. When she stands in her corner, bouncing on the balls of her feet, the crowd isn't just cheering, they are worshipping. They see their champion. They see the proof that Dutch power is the absolute standard of violence in Europe. Then, the side door opens. There is no music. There is no fanfare. There is no announcer barking into a microphone to build the hype. A man walks in. He's 5'7", maybe 135 pounds if he's had a heavy breakfast. He is a Chinese-American actor, a face that these Dutch locals haven't seen on their movie posters or their TV screens. To the men leaning against the ropes, the contrast is so extreme it's offensive. They start to laugh. It's not a polite, reserved chuckle. It's the deep, mocking laughter of people who genuinely believe they are watching a prank. They shout things in Dutch, crude comments about the movie star and the little man who has clearly lost his mind. They expect this to be a quick, humiliating display. Maybe he survives a minute. Maybe he lasts 3. But they are certain that as soon as Saskia decides to turn the dial up, this stranger is going to disintegrate. He climbs through the ropes, his movements fluid, almost feline, but entirely out of place in this environment of raw, blunt force brutality. He doesn't look angry. He doesn't look intimidated. He doesn't even look like a fighter, at least not the kind they recognize. He wears simple, black athletic shorts. His torso is bare, revealing a frame that looks almost fragile, like a stick figure standing in front of a steel beam. The laughter ripples through the crowd again, louder this time. The absurdity of it is the only thing they can focus on. How could this be a fight? It's not a contest, it's an execution. Saskia stands across from him, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning him with a mix of confusion and pity. She's waiting for the joke to end so she can get back to business. The referee, a local named Varnum, steps between them. He's a man who has seen enough blood in that ring to know when things are going to get messy. But even he seems slightly uncomfortable, looking between the giant woman and the lean man. He starts to go over the rules: full contact, 3 rounds, 5 minutes each. No groin shots, no eye gouges. But his words barely register with the crowd, who are too busy making bets on how fast Saskia will send this guy to the floor. As the two fighters touch gloves, the visual is jarring. Saskia's hand is massive, her knuckles calloused and scarred from years of hitting heavy bags and hard skulls. The man's hand is smaller, tighter, lacking that specific, thick-knuckled look of a slugger. But there is something in the way he grips, a calmness in his wrist that doesn't quite match the vulnerability of his frame. They step back. The crowd noise reaches a fever pitch, a wall of sound, a mix of taunts and anticipation. Bruce Lee takes his corner. He stands there perfectly still, his eyes locked not on his opponent, but on the space just in front of him. He is breathing in long, slow cycles, completely detached from the roar of the crowd, the mockery, and the overwhelming weight of the person standing across from him. He isn't fighting for pride. He isn't fighting to prove he's the toughest. He's here for a different reason entirely. A reason that the crowd, blinded by their bias and their belief in sheer size, is completely incapable of seeing. The air in the gym seems to go heavy, pressurized. The smell of the cold, damp concrete mixes with the scent of adrenaline. The referee glances at both of them, his hand hovering, ready to signal the start. The laughter in the room begins to die down, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath as people lean forward, sensing, just for a split second, that the man they are watching might not be the victim they assumed him to be. The bell is about to ring, and the world, or at least the 20 people in this warehouse, is about to change forever. The bell didn't ring with the polite clarity of a professional stadium event. It was a sharp, jagged, and somewhat tinny sound that rattled against the corrugated metal walls of the warehouse, instantly swallowed by the damp air. It was a signal that the theatre was over. The reality of violence was about to begin. Saskia didn't waste a single heartbeat. She didn't bother with the traditional feeling out process where fighters circle each other, measuring distance, testing feints, and gauging reactions. She knew exactly what she was. She was the hammer, and she was looking for the nail. With a stride that seemed too heavy for a human, she closed the distance instantly. She launched a right low kick, the kind of strike that had built her reputation, the kind that had ended 11 professional bouts before the second round could even begin. In her mind, this was the end. She was aiming for the lead leg, putting the full rotational force of her 240-pound frame into a movement designed to shatter the nerves and blood vessels of anyone standing in her way. It was a kick meant to buckle knees and drop opponents in a heap. To the onlookers, it looked like a tree limb swinging with the force of a wrecking ball. The sound of the wind rushing past her leg was audible, a sharp whoosh that cut through the humid gym air. Bruce Lee didn't step back. Most fighters, facing that kind of raw, destructive force, would retreat. They would circle, they would shy away, they would try to get out of the radius of the impact. But Bruce did the one thing that no one in that gym expected. He moved forward. He didn't just meet the kick, he checked it. It was a movement so subtle, so instantaneous, that if you blinked, you would have missed it entirely. He brought his leg up, shin to shin, colliding with her strike at the point of maximum force. The sound was sickening, a hard, resonant thwack of bone meeting bone that echoed off the warehouse rafters like a gunshot. Anyone else would have absorbed that impact, their leg buckling, their balance shattered. But Bruce flowed with it. He didn't lock his joints against the collision. He absorbed the energy, redirected the momentum, and in the fraction of a second while Saskia was still retracted, still committed to the follow-through of her kick, he was already inside her guard. He didn't wind up. He didn't telegraph the movement with a shift in his shoulders or a change in his eyes. He simply extended his hand, a short, sharp punch that traveled maybe 6 inches. A distance so small it shouldn't have generated any power at all. But it landed square on her ribs. The crack of the impact made several people in the front row gasp out loud. It was a dry, snapping sound, like a branch breaking under pressure. Saskia's eyes widened, not in fear, but in absolute, jarring surprise. She had been hit by heavyweights before. She had traded blows with men who outweighed her, men who swung with the desperation of people fighting for their lives. But she had never felt this. It wasn't the brute force of a heavy strike. It was the surgical precision of an impact that felt like it bypassed her skin and muscle and rattled the very cage of her chest. She wasn't used to being reached. She wasn't used to the idea that her physical superiority could be neutralized by someone who wasn't even straining. She didn't hesitate, though. The shock was momentary, eclipsed instantly by the burning heat of her competitive drive. She recoiled, spinning back into a left hook aimed directly at Bruce's jaw. This was a punch thrown with every ounce of rotation in her hips, a swing that could have ended the fight on its own. If it had landed, the story would have been over before it had begun. The room seemed to hold its breath. Bruce didn't duck low. He didn't retreat to the ropes. He simply tilted his head, a slip of maybe 4 inches, just enough to let the air of her fist ruffle his hair. He felt the wind of the punch as it whistled past his ear, close enough to be dangerous, but far enough to be manageable. And then, he countered. Before her arm had even fully extended, before she had the chance to reset her weight or shift her stance, Bruce drove a straight right hand into her solar plexus. It was another short, economical strike. It was a jab, really, but it carried the weight of intent and perfect timing. The air left Saskia's lungs in an audible huff. It wasn't a scream or a cry of pain. It was the involuntary expulsion of oxygen that happens when the diaphragm is shocked. For the first time in 37 professional matches, she was forced to take a step backward. Not because she chose to, not because she was setting up a trap, but because her body forced her to. Her feet dragged against the canvas, and for a split second she looked human. The crowd, which had been loud and rowdy just seconds ago, was suddenly struck with a strange, heavy silence. The laughing had stopped. The shouting of taunts died in the throats of the men leaning against the ropes. They were looking at their champion, the woman who had never been touched, and they were seeing her struggle to reclaim her balance. Bruce, meanwhile, didn't pursue. He didn't go in for the kill. He simply reset to his original stance, his hands loose, his weight perfectly centered, his expression calm. He was waiting. Saskia stood there for a heartbeat, her chest heaving as she tried to force the air back into her lungs. She looked at him, not with the pity she had held before, but with a growing, cold recognition. She was staring at someone she couldn't categorize. She was staring at a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tension so thick it felt like electricity. The warehouse air, which had seemed so cold and damp just minutes ago, suddenly felt hot, charged with the energy of 20 people realizing that they were witnessing something that defied the rules of the world they understood. Saskia wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her jaw set, her eyes hardening into slits. The game was over. The joke was over. And as she shifted her stance, preparing for the next movement, she knew one thing for certain. She was going to have to fight for her life. The bell had rung, but the real war was only just beginning. The silence in the warehouse wasn't the absence of sound, it was the weight of a collective disbelief. The 20 people gathered around the ring, the men who had spent their lives measuring violence in cracked ribs and broken noses, were frozen. They had come to watch an execution, to see their local titan, Saskia, dismantle a movie star. Instead, they were watching their own reality shatter. Saskia stood in the center of the ring, her massive chest heaving. That short, sharp strike to her solar plexus hadn't just stolen her breath, it had stolen her rhythm. She was a machine, calibrated for a specific type of combat, a world of brute force, of trading leather for leather, of outlasting the opponent through sheer, immovable mass. But this man was something else. He wasn't trading blows, he was redirecting them. She reset her stance, her eyes narrowing into slits. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a cold, boiling fury. She was a professional. She knew that emotion was the death of a fighter, yet she couldn't help the tremor of anger vibrating in her hands. She decided, in that split second, that she had been too reckless. She had underestimated the target. Now, she would treat this like a real fight. She came forward again, but this time, there was caution. She threw a probing jab, a feint designed to see how he would react. Bruce didn't retreat. He didn't shell up. He slipped the jab by a mere millimeter, a movement so economic it looked like he was merely nodding to a friend. Saskia followed immediately with a right cross, the same punch that had put dozens of men on the canvas. She put her entire back into it, the rotation of her hips driving the force up through her shoulder and into her fist. It was a perfect punch. In any other ring, in any other match, it would have connected. But Bruce Lee wasn't in that space. He had already moved, sliding under the arc of her arm, his feet tracing a path that kept him just out of reach, while simultaneously putting him in a perfect position to counter. She didn't hesitate, though. The shock was momentary, eclipsed instantly by the burning heat of her competitive drive. She recoiled, spinning back into a left hook aimed directly at Bruce's jaw. This was a punch thrown with every ounce of rotation in her hips, a swing that could have ended the fight on its own. If it had landed, the story would have been over before it had begun. The room seemed to hold its breath. Bruce didn't duck low. He didn't retreat to the ropes. He simply tilted his head, a slip of maybe 4 inches, just enough to let the air of her fist ruffle his hair. He felt the wind of the punch as it whistled past his ear, close enough to be dangerous, but far enough to be manageable. And then he countered. Before her arm had even fully extended, before she had the chance to reset her weight or shift her stance, Bruce drove a straight right hand into her solar plexus. It was another short, economical strike. It was a jab, really, but it carried the weight of intent and perfect timing. The air left Saskia's lungs in an audible huff. It wasn't a scream or a cry of pain. It was the involuntary expulsion of oxygen that happens when the diaphragm is shocked. For the first time in 37 professional matches, she was forced to take a step backward. Not because she chose to, not because she was setting up a trap, but because her body forced her to. Her feet dragged against the canvas, and for a split second, she looked human. The crowd, which had been loud and rowdy just seconds ago, was suddenly struck with a strange, heavy silence. The laughing had stopped. The shouting of taunts died in the throats of the men leaning against the ropes. They were looking at their champion, the woman who had never been touched, and they were seeing her struggle to reclaim her balance. Bruce, meanwhile, didn't pursue. He didn't go in for the kill. He simply reset to his original stance, his hands loose, his weight perfectly centered, his expression calm. He was waiting. Saskia stood there for a heartbeat, her chest heaving as she tried to force the air back into her lungs. She looked at him, not with the pity she had held before, but with a growing, cold recognition. She was staring at someone she couldn't categorize. She was staring at a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tension so thick it felt like electricity. The warehouse air, which had seemed so cold and damp just minutes ago, suddenly felt hot, charged with the energy of 20 people realizing that they were witnessing something that defied the rules of the world they understood. Saskia wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, her jaw set, her eyes hardening into slits. The game was over. The joke was over. And as she shifted her stance, preparing for the next movement, she knew one thing for certain. She was going to have to fight for her life. The bell had rung, but the real war was only just beginning. The silence in the warehouse wasn't the absence of sound. It was the weight of a collective disbelief. The 20 people gathered around the ring, the men who had spent their lives measuring violence in cracked ribs and broken noses, were frozen. They had come to watch an execution, to see their local titan, Saskia, dismantle a movie star. Instead, they were watching their own reality shatter. Saskia stood in the center of the ring, her massive chest heaving. That short, sharp strike to her solar plexus hadn't just stolen her breath, it had stolen her rhythm. She was a machine calibrated for a specific type of combat, a world of brute force, of trading leather for leather, of outlasting the opponent through sheer, immovable mass. But this man was something else. He wasn't trading blows, he was redirecting them. She reset her stance, her eyes narrowing into slits. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a cold, boiling fury. She was a professional. She knew that emotion was the death of a fighter, yet she couldn't help the tremor of anger vibrating in her hands. She decided, in that split second, that she had been too reckless. She had underestimated the target. Now, she would treat this like a real fight. She came forward again, but this time, there was caution. She threw a probing jab, a feint designed to see how he would react. Bruce didn't retreat. He didn't shell up. He slipped the jab by a mere millimeter, a movement so economic it looked like he was merely nodding to a friend. Saskia followed immediately with a right cross, the same punch that had put dozens of men on the canvas. She put her entire back into it, the rotation of her hips driving the force up through her shoulder and into her fist. It was a perfect punch. In any other ring, In any other match, it would have connected. But Bruce Lee wasn't in that space. He had already moved, sliding under the arc of her arm, his feet tracing a path that kept him just out of reach, while simultaneously putting him in a perfect position to counter. He didn't just avoid the punch. He made her miss by such a distance that she felt the momentum drag her forward, pulling her off balance. She corrected, stumbling slightly, and immediately threw a left kick to his midsection. It was a heavy, thudding strike. Bruce caught it. He didn't just block it with his arm. He reached out and plucked the kick from the air as if he were catching a slow-moving ball. Her leg, all 40-plus pounds of conditioned muscle and bone, was trapped in his grasp. The room went deathly still. The sound of her leg hitting his palm was sharp, a slap of skin on skin that reverberated through the damp, cold space. For a heartbeat, they were locked together, a tableau of impossible physics. Saskia tried to yank her leg back, to force her weight down, to crush him with her sheer mass. But Bruce was already moving. He didn't fight the weight, he used the leverage. He swept her standing leg with a quick, snapping motion, his own foot finding the pivot point of her base. Saskia's eyes widened. She had no time to compensate. She was already falling. The impact of her 240-pound frame hitting the canvas shook the entire ring. The ropes groaned, the floorboards beneath the mat shivered, and the sound was like a tree falling in a forest, a heavy, hollow thud that silenced even the most vocal skeptics in the crowd. She landed on her back, the breath driven out of her with a ragged sound, the lights of the warehouse spinning above her. The referee, Vanham, stepped in immediately. "1," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he started the count. 2, 3. Saskia lay there for a second, staring up at the yellow, buzzing lights. She wasn't unconscious, but she was dazed. The world felt inverted. She had spent her entire adult life being the one who stood over the fallen, the one who looked down at the defeated. Being on the receiving end felt like an assault on her identity. 4, 5. She scrambled to get up, her muscles screaming, her pride burning hotter than her pain. She pushed herself up onto one knee, then the other, her equilibrium fighting to stabilize. She stood, swaying, her breathing ragged, looking across the ring at Bruce. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't taunting. He was just standing there, his hands loose at his sides, his eyes searching, analytical, as if he were waiting to see if she was ready to learn the next lesson. The referee looked into her eyes, checking for the clarity of her focus. He asked her a question in Dutch. She nodded, curtly, refusing to let him see the fear that was beginning to gnaw at the edges of her resolve. The fight resumed, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The crowd, which had started the night laughing, was now witnessing something they couldn't comprehend. They were seeing a man who didn't fight with strength, but with a terrifying, absolute understanding of how the body moved, how it broke, and how it could be controlled. Saskia's next attack wasn't a combination, it was an act of desperation. She lunged, abandoning all technical defense, trying to smother him with her size, to close the distance until he had nowhere to go, no room to slip or weave. She wanted to force a clinch, to drag him into a messy, grinding war where her weight would eventually grind him into the dust. But as she rushed him, she found that Bruce wasn't there. He was everywhere, slipping inside, moving to her blind spot, tapping her ribs, checking her forearms, keeping her constantly off balance. It was like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. Every time she reached for him, he was already gone, and in the space he left behind, a sharp, precise strike would land. He was breaking her down, not with one massive blow, but with 1,000 tiny interruptions. Her ribs were on fire from the constant body shots. Her arms felt heavy, leaden from the effort of swinging at nothing. The cold air of the warehouse, which had been so bracing at the start of the night, now felt suffocating. She was sweating, not from exertion alone, but from the terrifying realization that she was completely outmatched in a language she had spoken her entire life. Across the ring, Bruce's expression never changed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't enjoying the punishment. He was simply performing a function, executing a philosophy that relied on efficiency above all else. He was a man who had mastered the art of not doing, of letting his opponent's own energy become the weapon that destroyed them. And as Saskia prepared to charge again, her chest burning, her legs trembling, she realized with a sinking heart that the man in front of her wasn't fighting her. He was waiting for her to finish destroying herself. The minute of rest between rounds felt like a lifetime suspended in amber. For Saskia, it was a blur of shouting and cold water. Her coach, a man named Rick, who had stood in her corner for over a decade, was barking instructions in Dutch, his voice a frantic buzz in her ear. He was talking about distance, about leverage, about using her reach. But Saskia couldn't hear the words. All she could hear was the frantic pounding of her own heart, a drumbeat of exhaustion and humiliation. She looked across the ring, her gaze burning into the space where Bruce sat on his stool. He wasn't sitting like a man who had just engaged in a violent exchange. He wasn't panting. He wasn't shaking out his arms or dabbing sweat from his eyes. He sat with his spine straight, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes closed. He looked less like a fighter preparing for round 2 and more like a monk in meditation. It was infuriating. To Saskia, that stillness felt like a personal insult, a sign that he didn't view her as a threat, or even as an equal. The bell rang for the second round, a harsh metallic clang that signaled the final act. Saskia came out with a new, dangerous resolve. She had realized that the rage, while powerful, was blinding her. She needed to be clinical. She took the center of the ring, her feet planted, her hands high. She forced herself to breathe, to find that rhythm that had seen her through dozens of fights. She would keep him at bay. She would use her reach, her jab, her long, punishing low kicks to keep him on the outside, forcing him to walk into her trap. It was the correct strategy. Against anyone else, it would have ended the fight in 30 seconds. But Bruce wasn't anyone else. As Saskia advanced, trying to dictate the flow, Bruce began to apply a different kind of pressure. He didn't rush her. He moved toward her with a constant, predatory glide. He wasn't fighting for space. He was taking it, eating away the distance until she felt like the walls of the ring were closing in. Every time she tried to circle away, to find the open air of the canvas, he was there, cutting off the angle before she could even shift her weight. She threw a low kick, a measured, powerful strike aimed at his thigh. Bruce checked it, his shin bone meeting hers with a dull thud. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he pivoted, moving into the pocket of her defense. She threw a right cross, her best punch, the one she had perfected over years of drilling, and he slipped it with a movement so small, so subtle, that it felt like he had simply vanished into the air around her. The frustration began to leak into her movements. She started to overcommit, throwing punches with too much intent, legs with too much power, and every miss left her exposed. Bruce didn't land knockout blows, he landed surgical ones. A quick, stinging jab to the ribs, a sharp, snapping strike to the solar plexus, a light, maddening tap to the jaw. It was like being stung by 1,000 hornets. Each hit didn't take her down, but they accumulated, turning her arms into lead and her lungs into fire. 2 minutes into the round, the mask of the champion finally cracked. Saskia's eyes, usually so focused and cold, were now wide, darting, searching. She was realizing the truth that had been whispered in her mind since the first bell. She was bigger, she was stronger, she was more powerful, and none of it mattered. He was operating on a level of combat that ignored the physical dimensions she relied upon. He was finding the gaps in her armor that she didn't even know existed. She let out a guttural sound, a roar of pure, unadulterated desperation. She decided to abandon the strategy. She decided to end it. She threw everything she had in one final, explosive combination. A high kick to the head, followed immediately by a spinning back fist, a flying knee, and a wild, heavy-handed hook. It was a sequence of strikes that would have pulverized a lesser fighter, a whirlwind of violence intended to overwhelm him, to crush him through sheer force of will. Bruce didn't just survive it, he dissected it. He moved through the combination like a ghost passing through a storm. He leaned back for the high kick, the air of her shin whistling past his chin. He ducked under the spinning back fist, the force of her momentum carrying her past him. He stepped to the side of the flying knee, catching her elbow and redirecting it so that she stumbled forward, her own weight working against her. She was open. For a fraction of a second, the champion was exposed, her guard down, her momentum spent. Bruce didn't hesitate. He didn't waste a single ounce of energy. He stepped into the gap, his body coiled, and delivered a right cross that landed clean on her jaw. It wasn't a haymaker. It wasn't a wild, swinging punch. It was a straight, powerful drive that snapped her head back. The impact was instant. Saskia's eyes rolled back for a split second, her knees turning to water. The world beneath her feet disappeared. The ceiling lights, which had been buzzing with the tension of the fight, suddenly inverted. She hit the canvas with the sound of a falling weight. It wasn't the thud of a knockdown. It was the collapse of a building that had lost its foundation. She lay there, her massive frame sprawled across the stained canvas, her chest heaving, her hands twitching as they tried to remember how to fight. The warehouse went dead silent. Not the silence of anticipation, but the deep, hollow silence of shock. The 20 witnesses stared, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just seen. The woman who had never been defeated, the woman who had broken men and left them in the dust, was lying on the floor, staring up at the ceiling, her body finally surrendering to the impossible. The referee, Vanham, stood over her, his hand counting the rhythm of the end. 1, 2, 3. Saskia's eyes were open, but they were unseeing. Her mind was racing, trying to process the fact that she was here, on the floor, beaten by a man who looked like he had barely broken a sweat. The fire in her chest was turning to ash, the adrenaline receding, leaving only the cold, hard reality of defeat. She tried to push herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, but her body wouldn't obey. The punch hadn't just scrambled her senses, it had shattered her belief in the very foundation of her own strength. She made it to one knee, her frame swaying like a tree in a storm, and then slowly, she looked across the ring. Bruce was standing in the center, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythmic cadence. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't shouting. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, waiting to see if the fight was truly over. And as Saskia looked at him, she knew. She knew that there was no more fight left. Not because she was hurt, but because she had been outclassed in a way that made any further struggle futile. She wasn't just beaten, she was finished. The war she had started in her own mind was over, and she had lost to a man who had proven that the greatest weapon wasn't the strength of your muscles, but the clarity of your intent. The referee's count, which had seemed to drag on for an eternity, finally reached its conclusion. Vanham stood over Saskia, his eyes scanning her face, looking for the light of competition. It wasn't there. The fire had been doused by the cold, hard reality of that final cross. She was on her knees, her body swaying, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She raised a hand, a simple, tired gesture, a wave. She was done. She wasn't just unable to continue, she was unwilling to force her body into a space where it no longer belonged. The official call was a technical knockout, barely 3 minutes into the second round. 2 minutes and 47 seconds. The time it takes to brew a cup of coffee was all it took for the hierarchy of the room to be completely dismantled. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on the warehouse, deeper and more profound than the silence that had preceded the fight. The 20 witnesses, men who had built their identities on the worship of size and raw power, stood frozen. They weren't cheering for a winner, and they weren't jeering at a loser. They were stunned, caught in the uncomfortable gravitational pull of a truth they didn't know how to handle. They had seen the impossible, and in doing so they had been forced to confront the inadequacy of their own assumptions. Bruce Lee didn't raise his arms in triumph. He didn't pace the ring, he didn't point at the crowd, and he didn't offer a roar of victory. He simply stood in his corner, his breathing already returning to a rhythmic, meditative baseline. He watched Saskia with the calm, detached gaze of a teacher observing a student who had finally reached a breakthrough. He walked across the canvas, his movements light and effortless. When he reached her, he didn't look down, he knelt. He reached out a hand, not a conquering fist, but an open palm. Saskia looked at that hand for a long time. She looked at his knuckles, the skin unbroken, the arm steady. She looked up into his eyes, searching for malice, for arrogance, for the gloating pride of a man who had just dismantled a legend. She found none of it. She found only a quiet, grounded recognition. He wasn't celebrating her defeat, he was validating her effort. He was acknowledging that she had fought with everything she had, and that the loss wasn't a shame, it was an initiation. She took his hand. As he pulled her to her feet, the two of them stood in the center of the ring, a visual study in contradictions. The 240-pound champion and the 135-pound philosopher. She stood taller, broader, a towering silhouette against his smaller frame. Yet in that moment, the power dynamic had completely inverted. The crowd began to stir, a slow, tentative applause starting from the back of the room and rippling forward, growing until it filled the space. It wasn't the roar of a stadium, it was the respectful clatter of people realizing they had been part of a secret history. Saskia looked at the crowd, then back at Bruce. Her coach, Rick, had pushed through the ropes and was already at her side, ice in hand, but she waved him away. She needed this moment. She lifted Bruce's hand, not because she was forced to, but because the code of the fighter, which she had lived by her entire life, demanded it. She was paying tribute to the only person who had ever shown her the limits of her own strength. The rest of the night was a blur. The journalists who had been there, their notebooks out, their cameras ready, were paralyzed by the same disbelief as the crowd. The photographs they took would later be dismissed, argued over, and eventually tucked away in dark corners, labeled as impossible, because the math just didn't work. The narrative of a man half the size of a heavyweight champion dismantling her in under 3 minutes was too clean, too cinematic, too perfect. It was easier to call it a fake than to admit that the world they thought they understood was wrong. But for Saskia, the story was just beginning. In the days that followed, the bruises on her ribs would heal and the soreness in her legs would fade, but the imprint of that fight would remain. She would retire from the underground circuit, not because she was broken, but because she was changed. She spent the next 3 years obsessed with the principles she had glimpsed in those few minutes of violence. She sought out the lessons of Jeet Kune Do, the idea that one must be like water, that one must adapt to the opponent rather than forcing the opponent to adapt to you. She fought 15 more times in her career, and in every single match, she carried the ghost of that Amsterdam warehouse with her. She stopped relying on her mass as a bludgeon. She started using her reach as a tool, her weight as a fulcrum, and her mind as the primary weapon. She became a smarter, more elegant, and infinitely more dangerous fighter. She would tell friends, years later, that she had learned more in those 3 minutes of losing to Bruce Lee than in all the years of winning against everyone else. Bruce left Amsterdam the very next morning. There was no fanfare, no headlines, no official record. He vanished into the rhythm of his own life, a man moving through the world with a singular, quiet purpose. He didn't fight for the glory of the win. He fought to expand the boundaries of what was considered possible. And that is why the story endures. Not because it was a spectacle, but because it was a moment of profound human clarity. It's the story of a giant and a master, of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable mind. It reminds us that when we strip away the noise of the crowd, the weight of our own expectations, and the arrogance of our strengths, we are left with the only thing that truly matters: the ability to see, to learn, and to grow. The warehouse in Amsterdam is likely gone now, renovated into something else, or reclaimed by the slow decay of time. The ropes are rusted, the canvas is long replaced. But the memory of that day stays, suspended in the amber of legend. It exists in the space between the physical and the possible, a testament to the truth that no matter how big the obstacle and no matter how heavy the challenge, the true battle is never fought with muscle. It is always, and will always be, a victory of the mind.